Hello and welcome, friends, to another edition of Truth to Power, your happy hour here after work on Friday every week. My name is Justin Mogg. I'm one of the programmers here at Forward Radio. We always gather folks around the virtual microphones in the virtual studio for exciting conversations that you're not going to hear anywhere else on the radio, but only here on Community Radio, Forward Radio 106.5 FM. And you can find us at forwardradio.org, where we'll have some program notes and an archived edition of this show if you want to hear it again, or maybe you're listening now to our live stream at forwardradio.org. You'll also find a link to this program. You could share it out with your friends. It'll be posted on SoundCloud, and we'll have some great program notes too you might want to check out, because today we're really excited to talk about foraging. 'Tis the season, my friends, to get out there. Oh man, we're recording on Friday, the last day of April, and it is just a beautiful day out there. I was lucky enough to spend much of my day outside today, but I did not do any foraging. I did planting. I was being very conventional, thinking about how to get food out of the land. I hope that's an acceptable practice for today's conversation. The man you hear laughing, I'm so glad you'll recognize his voice. So glad to have him back on Truth to Power. That's our friend Hart Hagan, host of the Climate Report that you can hear every day on this station at 7 p.m. Welcome back, Hart. It's good to have you back with us.
It's so good to be here. I felt guilty being away. And I hope this is a somewhat regular thing going forward.
Oh, wonderful. We had some great conversations about you, man.
The prodigal son has come
circled
back.
Right. Great to have you back, Hart, on the show. And our special guest for today, his name is George Barnett. He's a forestry tech who is now moved into teaching foraging. Welcome, George.
Thank you guys so much for having me. It's looking forward to having a good conversation, and definitely 'tis the season for foraging.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, every season's good for foraging. Let's be clear. Well, I'm sure we'll talk about that today. But let me just say that George has started a business called the Hungry Forager, providing wild food education and consultation with landowners. And he also sells seasonal wild crafted and wild harvested products, and hosts workshops. Like I noticed you've got one coming up next weekend, right? Coming up on Saturday, May 8th, you're doing a spring foraging for kids workshop, right?
Yeah. So the very first year's workshop started last weekend. So we started with the spring foraging class. That was just kind of a broad spectrum on a lot of the spring native greens, a lot of invasive spring greens that shoot back up. And then, yeah, so this upcoming weekend, we're going to be having one that's kind of geared more towards children. I started doing those last autumn, and they really were just successful and really engaging, and the kids love it. And there's not really a better time to start learning those wild foods. And, what better yet to learn that when you're that young,
Yeah. So folks can learn about all of this and maybe sign up to participate at thehungryforager.com. I'm sure you got social media too, but that's the home base, thehungryforager.com. So what kind of ages of kids are you suggesting this workshop for? I mean, kids will eat anything, right?
Surprisingly, they're a lot more open to try things than their parents, and then also the adult classes. Yeah, generally the ages start around 4 or 5. That's about as young as I'll recommend. I won't turn away, but in regards to actually maybe taking something away, 4 or 5 generally, and then they go up to 13, 14, and it's really interesting to see the dynamic of just a group of a dozen kids of various ages and upbringings. For one, just participating in nature, interacting with it. It's such a beautiful thing. And, and then just for them to be able to learn and have that small enlightening type of conversation with their parents and other people's parents about trying something, or something that they might have, had in their backyard for their entire childhood.
Yeah.
To just then realize out in the woods or something that it's edible, or that that there's something about it to look out for once a year. So it's really a lot of fun.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah, I would have loved to do that as a kid. My parents didn't teach me a thing about foraging. But I'm super into it now. I don't know as much as I should. I'm always learning more. I think you're totally right. It's like it's one of the best ways to sort of reconnect with natural systems and ecosystems is to start looking for things as if you needed to depend on them, because we truly do.
Yeah,
We just create imaginary walls as if we didn't depend on nature, right?
absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, I think it's just kind of hardwired, you know, you could say unfortunately for modern times, and, you know, and particularly for Western, you know, culture and traditions, at least modern, it's a lot of forgotten stuff, right? And so I always stress during these workshops that it's not so much that I'm trying to teach, I'm trying to re-educate what we've forgotten as a species. That's really the angle, is that, you know, everything that we, you know, get at Kroger or Whole Foods, that all had a wild cousin or ancestor, and that's what those species are that we're out there looking for in the spring and autumn and in the summer. So it's just really important to kind of have more of a remembering than more of a learning. So
Yeah, you're kind of returning on a part of your brain that's been off for a while when you start.
exactly,
Right?
yeah, there you go, you got it.
Hart, have you been doing foraging? I know you really love wild plants, but I haven't talked to you too much about this particular issue.
I'm but a babe in this area. I mean, I went to Red River Gorge recently with Barbara, and you know, I kind of had a little bit of tea berry, and then there was this something, I forget what plant it was, but it reminded me of sweetgrass. My dad, or it was something that my dad called sweetgrass, and then there's this book by Robin Wall Kimmerer called Braiding Sweetgrass, fantastic book. But this, whatever it was I was eating, it gave me it reminded me of sweetgrass. And all of a sudden I remember being a kid, like on my lawn, and just picking up sweetgrass and eating it. Don't even remember what it looked like, but the taste, I can taste it now. So anyway, but I'm eager to be taught, because, you know, I'm supposed to be this climate guy. And the more we can get our food locally,
Yeah.
I mean, you know, I like saying that the Earth is on a weight gain plan, or the Earth naturally is on a weight gain plan. The Earth wants to gain biomass, and we do everything we can to sabotage all that through mowing and deforestation, et cetera. But the Earth naturally, you know, gains biomass over the course of time. So sun and water is going to produce a lot of food if we'll let it. And I think George is going to teach us how to recognize some of what we can eat.
Yeah. So George, tell us your story of how you got into foraging before we dive into some of those details of what people can start looking for here in the spring.
Yeah, sure. So roughly 10 years ago, I was just heavily into backpacking. At the time, I used to carry more camera equipment with me than field guides and foraging baskets and containers. And I was going out and shooting a lot of 35 millimeter film and Polaroids of different trees, and really macro shots of bark and fungi and things like that. And I wanted to be able to figure out what species I was, you know, documenting. And so then that led to me getting into field guides, and then started questioning more about, you know, just ecosystems and why are there certain native plants, what makes them work together, what makes an ecosystem more or less. And then that led into me leaving home with more field guides, less camera equipment, to, you know, to now where I'm just going out usually with a basket or two or a couple of mesh bags, and trying to interact with these species and make them a part of my life as consistently as I can. And so really it was just a lot of curiosity. And I feel like the curious side of me and almost the accidental paths that you take can sometimes lead to the most fulfilling and maybe the more intuitional in hindsight. And so that was really where it began for me. And mushrooms, mycology kind of called to me largely. That was kind of a really attractive part of foraging, but also just ecosystem rehabilitation. And that was something that led into the interest of, you know, how do I go out and identify these species, and then that led to spore prints and, you know, all these other fun little characteristics.
Hallucinations.
No, yeah, never had experience with those, but you know, really learning that side of ecology and how so much of our plant material and woody, you know, plant material, how all these different woody plants, herbaceous plants, all really work together through a network of mycelium, and that, you know, that being basically the actual structure of what produces what we call a mushroom, which is more or less the fruiting structure. You know, can, in the sense, mycelium is, I'll use a term here as
lay it on.
An apple tree, right? And, you know, the apple is the mushroom. That's effectively exactly what that system is. They send up fruiting bodies for the purpose of reproduction. And so, you know, so much of the work that mushrooms and fungus does is, you know, they're recyclers of woody material. They break down lignin and cellulose to trees. That's why we're not under an ocean of wood. It's all thanks to them, right? And as well as all of the other plant material. That's why we're not under an ocean of leaves, you know? So they do so much.
Decomposers are so underrated. Decomposers are so underrated and under-recognized in the food system, the food web.
Correct. And that's, again, it goes back to Tris trying to kind of show folks what we've forgotten. You know, they've been such a large part of Homo sapiens diets. Ethnobotanically speaking, they've been, you know, part of our diets for such a long time, you know, even dating back, you know, thousands and thousands and thousands of years. They were used medicinally. You know, there's that famous Otzi the Iceman who was found, and he had a polypore on his little on his satchel, and the polypore that he was found to have on him was used as a medicinal resource.
Really?
And yeah, and so he actually had two. He had one that was commonly used even still today as a medicinal tincture or tea type of resource for colds and for immune system boosting. And then he also had one that's used often for tinder. It's called the tinder polypore, and you can actually use it to kind of carve out pieces of the underside surface where the pores are, and that creates a little bed that you can put embers into, and you can kind of smolder fire with for quite a long time. But yeah, they just have such a utilitarian use that, you know, people just see a mushroom and they think, you know, Mario, or they think, you know, the classic agaric toadstool, and that's really all that there is about mushrooms. And
I thought drugs came from pharmaceutical companies. You're telling me medicines can come from plants?
Absolutely. Yeah. I have a whole cabinet just filled with everything but pharmaceutical medicine, right? And so, and the great part about it is, and you know, and I'm not going to say that those medicines are free, right? Because everything comes with a cost. And that's not even really, you know, I'm not referring to my time going out into the field to harvest those things or maybe process them, but, you know, everything, whether it's just nature producing those things for its intention on reproduction, on just being, you know, everything comes with a price. And when it comes to, you know, making medicines anyway from nature, because really every food out in nature, you can consider a medicine. That's really the fun part about it is, you know, if you go to the store and you don't make a list of groceries, you end up getting all this stuff that you're like, oh man, I was hungry when I went to the store. Now I have all this junk food or this and that, right? We've all been.
I have a question, George. Is a variety of foods, is that good? Because we were talking at one point, and you said that, you know, we were talking about how our food that we get at the grocery is often nutrient poor. And you were talking about there's a declining number of different foods that people typically consume in a year's time. Can you share some of that with us?
Sure. With regard to that conversation, yeah. So when it comes to store-bought food, you know, those are engineered monocrops, right? And so that is a, you know, low nutrient, high yield type of system that we have engineered. And so for the, you know, the concept sounds nice in a way to feed everybody, but what you're producing to feed people with is something that is very low in nutrients. You just have more, mass as opposed to actual nutrients, right? And so when it comes to wild plant material and the studies on them that you can find online, through field guides, or even just take it upon you to consume those and see how you react to them as far as your body and how maybe how you feel after eating, wild greens for a week or a month or what have you. But yeah, so there's generally 30 to 40 foods that a standard American would eat in a year. That's about how much variety there's going to be when it comes to natural foods. I'm talking vegetables and plants primarily, fruits, all that stuff. Any kind of naturally occurring type of food like that. It's about 25 to 30 in a year for standard American, right? And a lot of that also comes with so many of the species that we are commercially selling and consuming so much. They're all really the same, family. Basically the Brocaceae family. So you're talking kale, broccoli, spinach, so many of these different leafy greens and green type of vegetables, they're all in the same family. And so they're just different varieties of the same species effectively. Although they taste different to us and we prepare them in various ways, you're getting the same nutrients out of them and not a lot of variety. And for anyone who knows about healthy ecosystems knows that is founded through diversity. So when we lack diversity in our diets, we're setting ourselves up to not be as healthy and as functional and as defensive as we should and once were. So when it comes to eating wild food, I really try to stress without preaching that you're not only connecting with nature and connecting in a more intimate, tangible way with your local landscape, but you're actually benefiting your body in a way to where it's going to be getting nutrients that we hundreds and thousands of years ago had to get us to a point in our lives where we are today. But now we're not having that no longer in our system. For example, the standard, at least in my coming to age, I'm 28, I'll be 29 this year. And, whenever I thought about, vitamin C growing up, I thought of Tang commercials with like the gorillas, right? Or the apes with the tangerines. And that's what I considered what was vitamin C or what vitamins were in the Flintstone gummies, right? And so you're kind of, you're told, showed, and sold all these things in this type of culture through marketing and through colors and what have you. And so you kind of get this misconception of where those things were spin-offs of engineers from. It's almost kind of like we're getting Fast and the Furious 12 when Fast and the Furious 1 is just out in the woods, basically.
Yeah.
Right. And so, for example, something that you can go out and harvest right now, like woolly violets, and they're greens, right?
Yep.
Like a cup full of just the greens of woolly violets will give you 4 to 5 times the amount of vitamin C as 3 or 4 large tangerines.
Wow.
Right? And so you're also talking about just a consumption difference too, and how much you're actually needing to consume to get to those levels. It's just some of the numbers and some of the comparisons are just really astounding, because you're just like, you read these things, you look into them, and then actually when you've lived them a little bit, and you can actually, firsthand that those things are not false, and that you are going to be feeling good and feeling better with, not this super restricted diet, but even if you're just allowing yourself to add that to your store-bought food, right? You're going to tell a difference. And it's pretty profound. And when it comes to how much time we can put into doing this, you don't have to put in a ton of time. That is one question that I'm often faced with during or after workshops, or even just through, emails through online, because I'm pretty active. We have a pretty active Facebook page. And so people, reach out to us on there and through our site. And they'll ask questions like, how many hours a day do you forage? And it's like, I have a full-time job. I have a 9-year-old son who's obsessed with soccer. I have a lot going on. But if you go out, and we might spend 3 to 5 hours on probably one particular day out of the week where we go and harvest greens, or it just depends on the season. Of course, that could be a day of mushroom foraging. That could be a day of wild blueberry or wild blackberry foraging. It just depends on the season, but you don't really have to put that much time into it. You can if you have that time, but you don't really have to put in, you don't have to quit your day job to go and forage. As beautiful as that sounds, most people can't do that, right? Because eventually you're going to run out of gas to get to the foraging spot, right? So it's one of those things where it's all relative to your life and how you can make that fit into your life. And I think that we owe it to ourselves to be able to fit in as little as we can just for the purpose of doing that. And so for people who have backyards that have weeds, that might have, violets or any of the cool weathered weeds that come up in your yard, they're 9 out of 10, they're edible and really tasty when you pick them at the right time. Now, of course, that comes with also realizing where you're harvesting those edibles. You can't, you don't want to I would never really forage wild greens on a city sidewalk, downtown. And that's really just because those areas are treated, right? They're treated for weeds. And so you have to be cognizant of where you're going to be collecting anything. I mean, that even goes for fruit trees. If it's in an urban area that that you've been to before and have seen, herbicide, pesticides being used at, you got to be cognizant of that. But
I will say that, though, George, if you go into the grocery store, everything you see is treated. Right?
Oh my God.
Bingo. That's a great point.
The question is how many billions of pounds are added to our fields in a year's time? Billions of pounds of pesticides.
And that's a great point. And it all comes back to, what can you do to offset that? What can you do to make it work for you? And so, if I were to go out and, buy a big, 2 or 3 big bushels of kale to make a nice, spring, summer salad with, but I can also go out and have an equal amount of maybe some chickweed or some violet greens or some wood nettle to add to that, then there you go. Right. And then you're going to need less of the store-bought food. So it's all about making it work for you in whichever way you see fit. Now, having said that, when you do have the time, or if the season permits it, or even if you just have a great area to forage those things, by all means, I would totally advocate to eat that exclusively if you could, because it is more nutrient dense. You don't need to worry about where it came from. You don't, and a lot of things too, it's like, think about it. It's no different than having a garden. If you go out and pick some Swiss chard or some kale out of your garden, think about how much longer you have to actually consume that before it goes bad, right? It's the same thing with foraging. Whatever you collect, once you get home with your harvest of whatever it may be, you're given a lot longer time to actually do something with that, either fresh, or you can take the initiative, depending on what it is, to process it to eat at a later date. And that's also a huge part of what we do, which also allows us to be able to eat wild food every day of the year if we want to. It's because there's so much, I still have probably 2 or 3 gallons of red oak acorns that are now fully dried, but they're sitting in an area where if I want to make an acorn pie crust this weekend, I could at least start that process. And we already, and then you can always just pull from different areas. Usually we harvest enough low bush blueberry to freeze. So anytime during the year, we can break them out, add them to our oatmeals, pancakes, muffins, or just eat them like, dinosaurs and just shove them down your face right out of the freezer while they're frozen. So and that's one of the fun things going back to like kid workshops is, they always ask like, does everything need to be processed? Or they're like, how do you eat it? And it's like, the best answer that I love giving kids in particular is there is no way. You just eat it, and you just shove, a huge fistful of chickweed into your mouth, and you're just like, it's delicious, and it really is something primal to it. It's just this going back to nature action, I'll call it. It's just something that once you start to engage in it and interact with it, you don't see those places the same way. And I don't look at seasons the same way anymore. I used to always associate seasons with something that was human. And now I don't. Now I associate seasons and months with certain wild edibles. And I feel like that is a more responsible perspective as a human being, because we're here because we eat food, right? We have to eat to live, and we have to rely on that, or at least we did at some point. And that, we weren't relying on, DoorDash or Amazon Prime for that. It was, we need to go out here and collect this, or, our community doesn't eat. And so it's really just a great way to, again, connect with your land, and also to figure out a little bit more about what you're after in nature and how you can better have a relationship to let it become a part of you too. That's always a thing too. It's like whenever we do eat acorns, I always make the joke, to my son anyway, that, we're eating oak trees, right? It's like, this is becoming a part of us. And if you see a beautiful plant that happens to be edible, it's like, that's becoming a part of your tissue, and it's just a beautiful way to look at it.
Our guest today here on Truth to Power is named George Barnett. He is founder of the Hungry Forager. He's always hungry. He's looking for more. he will come to your door and help you see these wild foods. You can learn
he
more.
Will pump you up.
Yeah. You can learn more about them at thehungryforager.com. There's many great, exciting workshops coming up. We mentioned the spring foraging workshop for kids on Saturday, the 8th of May. But then on June 12th, you're doing a medicinal mushroom workshop too. And I saw that you actually sell some tinctures, some mushroom tinctures on your website. Tell me about that. I've never even heard of mushroom tincture.
Okay, awesome. Yeah. So basically, there is a whole family of fungi that are deemed as polypores, and they're definitely not the only medicinal fungus out there, but there are two that I have commonly collected and have processed into medicine. And two of those, both which grow in central Kentucky. They're all throughout really North America. And yeah, so they're hard chitinous polypores. And what chitinous means is that they're just very tough. They have a really thick cell wall. So it's not something that you're just gonna eat like you would with an oyster mushroom or with a chanterelle, but they're these shelf-like fungus that break down cellulose, lignin in the trees, right? And a lot of them will flush various times throughout the year. And what I will do is harvest them, and then we'll grind them up with I have a kind of like a dedicated spice grinder that I got for all herbs and medicinal fungi. So I'll run them through that, and just to kind of release the surface area, right? And what I'll generally do is I'll pour those into a really large sterile glass jar, add some 90, 80 proof brandy or vodka to that.
Now you're talking.
There you go. And
every time right here.
And you generally let that sit for like 6 to 8 weeks.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And really it's more of a, it's a preference thing, but generally 6 weeks is shown to be kind of that magic time frame. And that time frame, what I'm referring to is that's about how long it takes for the alcohol to pull out the alcohol soluble contents, which are triterpenes. So for example, there's a medicinal fungus called turkey tail, Latin name Trametes versicolor. And that's a very common ubiquitous fungus. You see it on almost
beautiful.
Any kind of hardwood. Yeah, it's beautiful. It grows on oaks, elms, ash, all kinds of different species. So you see it in a lot of places. And so that is a definite one that we would use to make for tinctures. That actually has a lot of uses and just abilities too, because you can actually just take that and make it tea. You can just put it in water and let it simmer for 2-3 hours, and then you have a really nice kind of mild, savory tea that you can sweeten with stuff like maple syrup or honey. But doing tinctures with it, yeah, you just add it to your alcohol of choice, let it sit for the 6 to 8 weeks. And then you usually agitate it once or twice a day, just to kind of, mix it around, make sure everything's getting movement. And of course, you don't really have to worry about anything going bad in that period of time because you have such a high alcohol content. Once that time has elapsed, we would then strain that alcohol out, put that into its own jar, and then you're left with this alcohol-soaked turkey tail material that's been ground up, right? And then we would add that to a pot with some spring water, and then we would do this, basically the tea operation to that. So we would put in spring water and then let that simmer for 3 to 4 hours. And then what you're doing is you're pulling out the water-soluble compounds, which are polysaccharides. These two compounds, when mixed together, act as kind of like a 2-in-1 medicine. So you have your polysaccharides, which are basically working to help with inflammation, your gut biome, liver detoxant, and then you're also getting these triterpenes from the alcohol extract, and that's working for stuff like anti-cancer, antibacterial, and you're adding those together to have both of the constituents that they can provide into one tincture. And so once you have that tea that you've made with the water part, you add those together, and then what that term is called is a dual extract. So you've taken 2 extracts, added them together, and you have a dual extract. And so with turkey tail, that's definitely one that we do it with, just because it's so gregarious and so commonly fruiting. So there's never really going to be an area where you won't come across it. It's not rare in any way. And then we also do it with a larger fruiting body, which does grow in Louisville, but we commonly harvest it in more of the eastern Kentucky half or the Appalachians, and that's the Ganoderma Rishi mushroom. It's a huge, beautiful, lacquered in appearance red polypore, and we do the same process with it. It's the exact same process. Rishi, the only difference is that it's usually it kind of has more of a different use for it. It's for people who maybe have sleeping issues. It does cause a sense of ease and calm, but it also does act in the same way as far as kind of building up your immune system with all those polysaccharides and triterpenes. So there's a whole other world of medicinal fungi that could make this go on for 18 days, which we won't do, but you asked for it, Justin. So that's what we do with those tinctures. And that's definitely a great part of those workshops when we come across those species, because I try to paraphrase as much as I did just now, but you have these medicines that are just out there, right? And
well, let me ask you something, George. I heard this yesterday, and I really know my limits when it comes to health and medicine and things like that. But I heard something that made sense. I don't know if it's out there, and I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Zach Bush, but I discovered him yesterday. But he was saying that many of our diseases are the common root cause is inflammation. Cancer, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's are a result of inflammation in different parts of the body. And I was just wondering, some of these medicines, do they naturally deal with inflammation?
That's a great question. And from my personal experience, because this is that's a question that can be untruthfully answered to what I call the armchair forager, which is someone who maybe has a few field guides or is in a few Facebook groups, but doesn't really interact in a way that they can speak from experience. And I'm not trying to throw any type of light on those people, but when they try to definitively answer something, that's where there's a problem, because then you're creating a false narrative. And so in that regard, there are plenty of wild foods and medicinal foods. I also like to I'll reiterate that most wild foods are medicinal foods, that they just kind of happen to be hand in hand. But in regards to the inflammation and stuff like that, so for example, like dandelion, right? Everyone knows that that's probably one of the top 4 or 3 wild edibles that most people know in a household.
Yeah.
And so dandelion root in particular, when used to create a coffee tea-like beverage, that's promoted to offer digestive, calming. And that's a direct, impact to the inflammation in your body. Right. So, for example, if you were to be in a state of being bloated or just feeling, some type of way that made you feel lethargic or bloated or crampy, dandelion root tea is like what we would drink in this house to combat that. And it's such a ally to our household because that's what we use. We don't go and get Pepto or Tums or something that looks like, antifreeze and say, let's do this. Right? But we try to use these things that are local and that are localized to their utility to us. And, so there are definitely species out there, whether it be herbaceous, fruits, or nuts, or fungi, that native people, they didn't have, banana boat before they went out to go swim or hunt for the day, right? For the sunscreen, they would eat berries that had very endowed anthocyanins. So they would eat choke cherries, they would eat blueberries. That has UV protection in those fruits.
Wow.
And so you can almost kind of just word it as, I always say I eat my sunscreen. And it's because that morning I might have a smoothie of blueberries and choke cherries. But all medicines, all things that we associate as being medicinal, they're all naturally occurring out in nature. We've just found ways to, synthesize what we maybe are considering to be the most potent part of those species, and we slap a label on them. Yeah. And there you go. But
don't forget to patent it.
There you go. Well, and that's just the thing too, right? That's why you're not going to see this boom in wild foods or particular species in general to be used for certain in lieu of a huge bottle of plastic petroleum sunscreen. You're never going to see a company that says just go out and eat a fistful of blackberries or aronia berries and you'll be good to go, because they can't patent that. And it goes to the same thing with the medicinal tinctures, and medicinal tinctures go to everything.
That, but they think they can patent it.
Yeah, they think they can.
They think they can do a lot of things, and some of them get away with it.
They patented the neem tree for one thing.
The neem tree,
yeah. They patented basmati rice. Anyway, but I digress. So what else can we eat? We were talking about garlic mustard at one point, which is an invasive species.
Oh, right, yeah.
You were saying, George, that you can, if it hasn't been treated chemically, you can eat garlic. So how do you, now's a good time of year to be thinking about garlic mustard.
Yeah, and honestly, 4 weeks ago was a good time.
Yeah,
but
a little late now.
So garlic mustard, it's probably one of the most invasive herbaceous plants that I can think of. Yeah. It's really at the top of that line, and so and it can be treated with foliar sprays, but generally it's not for organizations that know how to eradicate it. Generally it's a pool and trash bag situation if they actually are trying to eradicate it before it goes to seed, of course. But in regards to its edibility, when you do harvest it at a younger state, so from my experience, it's generally the last week or so of March up and through mid-April. And at that point, it's not really even formed flowers yet. But, you know, you have this tender green that is very garlicky, but, you know, if you harvest enough of it, you can freeze it, and then you have potentially, you know, enough plant material to make pesto for, you know, 7 to 15 servings worth. And it's delicious. So I like to add it. Basically, we'll put it into a blender or a Vitamix with like avocados and some pine nuts, and then you have this delicious pesto. But, you know, when it's just sitting there going to seed and then creating its forever long rhizome, you know, crowding out the soil for, you know, where nothing else can grow, you know, that you're really missing out on an opportunity for food there. So that's one of those species too that I really try to implore people to harvest, because it's a delicious food source, but you're also kind of, you know, you are being an ecological steward and removing it, because you're, you know, giving the native plant material room to grow. And for, you know, those who don't understand what a rhizome is, that's effectively a horizontal root and stem system where it shoots into these colonies and crowds out anything else from being able to grow in those areas. That's why when you see garlic mustard, you're never just going to see one. You know, you're going to see a huge, you know, colony, like almost like a field of it. But that's definitely a species that is incredibly invasive. It's popular with the foraging culture just because it is so abundant. And if you know when to harvest it, you know, you're doing a really good deed. And again, you're left with a lot of food. So
what kinds of things are, I'm sorry to interrupt, what kind of things are coming up in the next month or so?
Yeah, so things I'm excited about in the next month or so. First off, I'm going to be looking at, not for harvesting yet, but I'll be checking on my blackberry patches, because they will start to, you know, be forming berries here soon. Pine pollen, so the eastern white pine, those pine or the pollen buds will be probably filled at that point. And we do collect some pine pollen for additions to pancake mixes or just for teas. And pine pollen has kind of a swath of nutrients and vitamins kind of built into it, but it's really prized for its testosterone boosting function.
All right,
so, have some of that.
Get that,
right. and so
not a spring chicken anymore.
It's not something that you would probably, you know, want to have unless you wanted some form of a testosterone boost. But so that's something that we'd like to harvest. It's a really kind of like a almond flour flavor, so it's really nice. And we add it to a lot of, like I said, baked dishes. Right now, a few of the spruce trees that I harvest from, they're sending out their new fresh lime green spruce tips. And that's a really fun one, because you can either just eat them fresh, or you can do something like spruce tip jelly, where you take a couple of cupfuls of just the lime green spruce tips that are just now forming at the ends of the boughs, and you can add those and just make a jelly with them. And so you would, you know, boil them in water and add your pectin and whatever type of sweetener you wanted, and you have this really delicate citrusy type of spruce flavored jelly. And that one's just a lot of fun. And oftentimes though, I'll harvest, you know, 6 to 8 cups worth, but when I get back to the house to actually produce my jelly, I've eaten a cup or something in the drive home, because they're really sweet. And spruce tips, when they're young like this in the spring, unlike pine needles, they're very soft. And so it's not like you have this waxy, you know, exterior to get through. You just have this really soft, delicate spruce tip. And so it just kind of melts in your mouth after a few chews. And again, it's just a really citrusy flavored bite, and loaded, like chock full of vitamin C, just delicious. And like I said, the jelly thing's a lot of fun, especially with, you know, if you have kids. And you can candy the spruce tips as well. That's something that a lot of people are into. You can just candy them and with like maple syrup or what have you. So that's a really exciting one. I'm going to be checking my cattail stocks here soon for cattail pollen. So that's something that we also collect. We collect it in a similar fashion, or for similar uses as I had before mentioned for the pine pollen, as far as adding it into baked dishes. cattail pollen, of course, you can harvest that in a higher quantity than with pine pollen. And it's worth noting that, you know, when you're harvesting something like for example, the cattail pollen, depending on how you're doing it, you know, or even the spruce tips, you know, the intention on foraging isn't just to take and, you know, not try to reciprocate or to take unsustainably. And what I mean by that is for people who forage, you know, something like spruce tips this time of year, you know, I find a patch or various patches of spruce trees to do to evenly distribute my impact on those spruce trees, right? And so I'm not going to be picking the spruce tips off of, you know, every single bow of a spruce that I find, because what you're removing is the
like the Lorax.
There you go, right? So you're removing that New Year's growth. And so you have to be mindful that, you know, by me taking this to put into my body or to feed my family, I'm going to be, you know, basically disrupting the growth for this season. Having said that, you know, that's not a lethal harvest when you do that on that particular species. You know, so that's also something that I really go into depth with during these workshops, is not only what's edible, you know, what is more nutrient dense than the other, but also how to actually harvest these species in a way that actually really comes from more of a reciprocal type of understanding on how to harvest from them that can maybe promote more growth, but also at least how to harvest them where they're not being hurt, their colonies are being hurt, unless again it's an invasive species where maybe it's you know, worthwhile to do so.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because it is possible to love this stuff to death. With garlic mustard, we literally want to do it, but
right.
But there are other things that we've seen. This has become problematic with things like wild ramps. People love them, right? People are always wanting to eat them, and they aren't like garlic mustard. They're not as prolific. So it is possible to overdo it, and we need to be careful. And that makes me think too about, I've been wanting to ask, when we're thinking about a place like Louisville, which is pretty dense urban environment, there's not that many wild places left. So how do people in a place like Louisville do this in a manner that's sensitive to the limited resources available to us as a big city, right?
Sure. No, I mean, and that's a great question. My only real answer to it is it involves being involved in a community. It's very difficult to be able to have this type of interaction and relationship in an urban environment, largely, unless you have some form of community. And that really just comes down to something as simple as, you know, if you notice that your neighbor has, just for example, instead of a whole bunch of arborvitaes, they have a bunch of Norway spruce or something. You can say, hey, you know, do you mind if I harvest your spruce tips this year? And maybe you just do it on a cyclic basis, where maybe you harvest on the even or odd years, or maybe from this tree this year and the next tree the next year, right? Or hey, you know, your yard is really beautiful, and I've noticed that you have, you know, 10 to 20 pounds worth of chickweed growing outside of your garden bed. You know, would you mind if, instead of you weed eating that, if I just cleaned it up for you? And then that's more of an immediate urban tactic, which I believe can work. And I would say 10 times out of 10 times that I have experienced bringing that to people, they've either had a lot of questions that's resulted in them looking at those weeds in a different way.
A totally new way, yeah.
Or at the very least, they will say, go ahead, I don't care. And at least if you're given that answer, and you maybe save their phone number or put a pin in your phone of where that was occurring this time at, you know, what year or what time of the year, you can go back to those areas and make that connection to say, hey, look, it's George. I'm here. It's black walnut season, and I just want to let you know I could stop by this weekend and, you know, collect those, you know, those 30 gallons of black walnuts if you're okay with it again. And so it's really just about observing, you know, and having a very observant kind of mind. You know, you can be driving down a city street and all of a sudden come across, you know, 6 serviceberry trees, and that could yield enough fruit to, you know, fill up your freezer 3 times over.
For sure.
So it's all about having connections. And for people that maybe don't have that option, I would just strongly suggest going out into natural places that maybe are a bit out of the city. Maybe, you know, I know that can be difficult for some people, but for people that do have the means to travel outside of the city and maybe to go to maybe some national parks or national forests, which is probably more closely for this area, because you can go online and get a simple type of outline of what is, you know, harvestable without a permit. And if there is something that is harvestable with a permit, go and get that permit. You know, pay that $20 to the Forest Service to go and harvest, you know, $2,000 worth of produce. Right. And so it's all about having connections. And of course, for the people who have the land, you know, people who have 10 plus acres, you know, when I go and do consulting work for people, we do these wild food consulting walkthroughs where basically people will have me come out and I'll walk their property with them, and I'll point out every single species that's available visibly to me upon that season. So that varies, of course, depending on the season, but I'll make a note of every single species and potentially what they could do with it and how they could continue to have that on their property year after year after year. And I'm not surprised anymore, but I was at first about how many species I would provide to them that they would have always and forever written off as not being anything more than a weed,
Right,
or anything more than a tree, or just something, just background, really.
Right.
And
Always on their land. Yeah.
yeah, just like, oh, you know, that's been, you know, these
Variety
chanterelles
is
have been
bad.
happening every year. And so, you know, when you can enlighten people about, you know, hey, you could potentially cut your grocery bill in half, or, you know, you're struggling with maybe inflammation or maybe a fog over your head. Well, turns out, you know, you have a 5-pound lion's mane mushroom fruiting, you know, from this beech tree on your property. And turns out, you know, that mushroom helps with cognitive issues and can help build new neural pathways. And so there's all these different things that, again, people either, you know, weren't raised knowing, so no harm on them, no foul. But if they can learn that about their landscape, whether they inhabit it or are closely living next to those areas and can interact and gain some of that, I think we owe it to ourselves to participate in that.
Yeah.
for sure.
We're getting towards the end of our time, and I haven't asked something I've been dying to ask, which for those of us who are already into this, it's like obvious, but I think for the vast majority of our listeners, we should talk about fear. Like people are afraid of eating something that is not packaged, that someone hasn't already like approved for them to eat, right? So and with kids, I'm sure you see it's a little different with kids, but let's talk about adult fear about wild things. Like, how do you overcome that with people? Do you have people showing up for your workshops who are afraid of this stuff?
I'm so glad that you brought that up, Justin. And the answer is yes. So, and again, yes, the kids are usually a bit more, you know, they believe and they see someone who's out here to tell them something, so they kind of go for it. But yeah, usually adults, they have a bias, and it's like you said, it comes from, you know, having lived mainly their whole life with something that says food, right? It's labeled eat, you know. So there is this type of bias that you have to break through with certain people, and some more than others. You know, there's obviously just people who understand it from the get out, and that's why they're there in the first place, is because they already know it. They just want to be maybe shown it.
Yeah.
But yeah, there is a huge divorcement from, you know, what we see food is. And so, you know, not everyone looks at something like a trout lily bulb or a chanterelle as food. They will look at it and say, oh my, you know, that's happening out here. That's occurring out in nature. And so there is a fear. I try to really acknowledge the importance of learning species in an effort to not have problems with that. Some of the main questions I always get is, have you ever poisoned yourself?
Yeah.
Have you ever almost died? This and that. And, has my body reacted to foods in an unfavorable way? Yes. Has that happened from food from the grocery store or a restaurant? Yes. So
It's not as bad as back shift.
that's the point that I'll make, is that everybody, has, variables on how they react to foods, right? And so outside of that, I will try to go in as depth as I can about, going botanical. If I have to get botanical about, the leaf arrangement, smells are a huge thing, coloration. And then especially when it comes to fungi, it's like, time of year, the ecosystem, so many different fungi have a particular role in ecology. And so if you see something that you might think is but it's not, refer back to this, conversation where I said, oh, it's growing from wood. These exclusively grow from wood. So if you see it growing terrestrially out of the soil, take that step and see, well, maybe it's fruiting from buried wood. And if it is, then maybe you're okay. But if you see that it's just popped right out of the soil and there's nothing underneath it, that's not that species. And so it's really about making a proper ID out in the field with people and trying to, help people that do have the fears. And, and also one of the things that can help, at least from a workshop, like the workshops standpoint, is eating it in front of them, right? Being the guinea pig. I feel like so much of those workshops can just be me eating and then talking with a mouthful. Yeah. And I'm mainly talking about fruits or herbaceous plants. Full disclosure, you're never supposed to eat a raw mushroom, even if it's coming from the grocery store. You're never supposed to eat raw mushrooms. They all need to be prepared with heat before they're consumed. And so, and the same with stuff like acorns. You're not going to just pick up acorns and eat them. There's a whole long process of leaching the tannins out of those acorns, which I also have taught an entire workshop last year on how to do that. And not all foods are created equal. Not all foods you can just pop in your mouth right from the stem, right from the soil, but there are those. And when it to kind of follow up with the last part of that point in question that you made, it's really just about trying to get rid of that fear. We are so far removed from what is truly real as far as food goes. And when I try to tell people about the diets that I've experimented with and where I'm currently at with eating wild food, they can really see a lot of enthusiasm, and that sometimes can excite them enough to believe me anyway, and maybe try it for themselves. So,
well, we are nearly out of time. I guess we have time for one last question. Hart, have you been itching to ask anything else?
I have about 20 different plants here that I want you to tell me how to find, prepare, and eat. Is that too much?
All right, we're gonna hire the Hungry Forager to come to Hart's house, it looks like.
There you go. You have my number, Hart.
Yeah.
I'm psyched. I mean,
this is great. Yeah.
George and I talked about doing videos and stuff. It's like I can so see a series where we get out into the woods and you just show people what's what, and you have a contagious enthusiasm and a deep knowledge of this stuff, and I can't wait to learn more.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate that, and really just to reiterate one last thing, it's this whole program is based around normalizing and bringing this information to anybody. It's not about overwhelming people with tons of Latin names. Those can be important for field IDs nonetheless, but it's not about this ego thing. It's not about overwhelming people. It's about, and that's why also too, I don't take people out and try to show them every single thing that is edible at one particular class, because classes generally are 3-4 hours, but there's so much out there, but I try to focus on the things that people can start with. It's all about how can you start? And I'll use the quote from a very prolific and authoritative forager that lives up in Wisconsin named Samuel Thayer. And he always has said, learn one plant at a time. And then he uses this really beautiful method of what he calls the banana method, more or less, which is where if you learn a plant or a fungi or a nut or a berry, what have you, learn that in a way that you would look at it like you would a banana. You don't look at a banana and think, is that a banana? And so if you can get that type of confidence and connection to a wild food, you got it figured out, and you never have to worry about, am I going to get sick or not? Because you just know.
Well, that's a great note to end on. I'm sorry we're all out of time. We feel like we've just scratched the surface of foraging. Thank you so much, George Barnett, for joining us today and getting us inspired to get out there and start eating off the land, my friend. Thank you.
Well, it was a pleasure, Justin, and Hart, thank you so much for making this happen. It's been a lot of fun, guys.
Thank you both.
Check them out at thehungryforager.com, and we will be back in your ears here on Truth to Power again in 1 week's time, my friends. Be well.
Bye-bye.
Take care.